So this week's lecture will be focusing on the practical aspects of developing a training program, as we went over the theory for developing a periodized training program last week. So far this semester, we talked about athlete needs analysis, athlete testing and program evaluation, dynamic warm-up, resistance training, and power training. We also just went over training integration and periodization. Now we'll focus on actually putting a program on paper. Probably the most complicated aspect of strength and conditioning is putting the entire program together, as you have to not only program for resistance training, but also anaerobic endurance, speed and agility, plyometrics, and balance and stability. Remember that the very core when creating a program for an athlete is that it is specific to their sport and the position that they play. So you wouldn't create the same program for an offensive lineman as you would for a wide receiver. Since there are many training methods that exist, these examples throughout the lecture should act as tools to be utilized at the appropriate times to optimize the athlete's performance. Before any workout, you can lead or direct a structured warm-up routine to prepare athletes for the training session. By providing a proper warm-up routine, this may help reduce the risk for injury during the training session. The use of a dynamic warm-up is preferred over static stretching in most cases, since a dynamic warm-up utilizes exercise-specific movement patterns. Also, it is important that this dynamic warm-up is non-fatiguing, also starts from a low intensity and slowly increases in intensity as you start going forward. And lastly, focuses on proper technique. Here, the figure on the right shows a sample of a dynamic warm-up, and just remember that a dynamic warm-up increases body temperature, enhances motor unit excitability, develops kinesthetic awareness, and then maximizes active range of motion. And also remember that this dynamic warm-up should last around 10 to 15 minutes. The goals of the off-season training program should be specific for each athlete. If you have an experienced strength and power athlete, incorporating ballistic exercises may be more effective than for a novice athlete. The reason you may incorporate more ballistic exercises is that it is a more effective way to accomplish the athlete's training goal. During the off-season, you will need to examine which training component has the most potential for improvement. And the way you can determine this is testing the athlete and then evaluating the results. Additionally, in particularly early part of the off-season, you want to focus on developing hypertrophy, strength, power, and speed. Even though the athlete is in the off-season, they should still practice their sports skills, such as playing some pickup games. Another goal during off-season programming may include altering body composition by increasing fat-free mass and decreasing fat mass. So to accomplish this, the athlete will be following the training program you create along with a nutritional strategy, most likely increasing protein intake and increasing caloric intake. Since the athlete isn't consumed by competitions and practice, the frequency of resistance training should be high. Furthermore, the training focus will depend on the goal for that specific athlete. And depending on the goal, that area may have a higher frequency of training. So for example, if the athlete's goal is to increase muscle growth along with, what we kind of just gave an example of, then, incorporating more hypertrophy days would be ideal compared to strength days. One thing to note is that the duration of the off-season may be shortened or extended. So let's take college football, for example. Usually they have spring football, and for them to perform optimally during that time, the hypertrophy phase and strength phase will be shortened to account for a small maintenance phase before spring ball. So here on this slide, this better depicts the duration of the different phases during training for an athlete. You can see on the left that this athlete does not have an interruption of spring football, so the hypertrophy and strength phases do not have to be shortened. But as you see on the right side, this is accounting for that interruption of spring football, and due to this, the athlete's hypertrophy and strength phases are shortened, and then a maintenance phase is included right before spring football so that the athlete can perform optimally during that time. The initial training phase is the preparatory phase, and during this period, the focus is on hypertrophy, strength, endurance. During this period, it is generally 4 to 8 weeks in length. However, this will depend on the athlete's goal. Moreover, this period is going to incorporate low to moderate intensity and high training volume. It is important, though, that the volume may need to be lowered depending on the athlete's recovery. So if they are a novice athlete or beginner, the increase in soreness may require them to have that lower training volume. But for advanced athletes, this will probably not be an issue. Also, including assistive exercises such as incline flies may be important for providing the necessary training stimulus for advanced athletes. So the example on the right shows a 4-day split routine for the upper body and the lower body where they are trained twice per week. So as you can see, the repetitions are more in line with hypertrophy. Last week, we talked about different periodization training methods. The most common method is linear periodization, where intensity starts low and volume is high. With continuation, intensity will increase and the training volume will decrease. Other strategies that are also, optional or involved is reverse linear periodization, where the volume is low and the intensity is high at the beginning, but then as training continues, the intensity will decrease and then the training volume increases. So this type of training may be more applicable for endurance athletes. We also have non-periodized, which is no plan variation. So this is typically straight plan sets of 3 sets of 6 repetitions, and the only thing that is occurring in this method is just increasing the load or progressive overload. The last one is daily undulating periodization, and this is sometimes referred to as nonlinear periodization. This is where the training zones will differ for each training session. Here we can see the structure of a linear periodization model. You can see the progression of intensity from low to high, and with volume going from very high to low. Remember that this type of training may be more suitable for novice or beginner athletes. This next example is an undulating periodization model. Here you can see that on Monday, the training focus is for power, Wednesday's training focus is on strength, and Friday's training focus is on hypertrophy. And the way you can tell by this is looking at the amount of sets performed and then also the amount of repetitions. The next cycle of training during the off season is generally focusing on strength. So this is where the intensity increases with a moderate to high training volume. The strength phase lasts between 4 to 6 weeks generally, but a thing that is different from the hypertrophy phase is that this is where you start to begin to incorporate Olympic style lifting movements. The Olympic style lifting may be incorporated earlier, but for novice athletes, they may benefit from developing a strength base and proper technique with traditional powerlifting exercises. So the inclusion of Olympic lifting moves can provide variation to the training program and also prevent staleness. In some programs, and depending on the athlete's experience, you may begin to incorporate additional modes of training such as plyometric exercises and possibly speed and agility exercises. However, incorporating speed and agility at this time is very unlikely. If you plan on incorporating plyometric exercises, you should not fatigue the athlete due to the additional training. So to keep the training volume equal for the phase, you'll need to reduce volume in other areas such as removing some assistive exercises, so like leg curls or RDLs. And by doing so, this is to help prevent overtraining from that additional training of plyometric exercises. Following the strength phase is the strength power phase. This is referencing the first transition period or preseason for the athlete. During this time, this is where you'll shift the focus on the strength you gained in the last phase into power development. At this time, the intensity will be low to very high depending on the exercise with a low training volume. It's possible that this phase may be interrupted depending on the sport, such as spring football, like we mentioned earlier. So following spring football, though, you may need to revert back to the hypertrophy phase to help with the recovery for the athlete. The strength and power phase puts greater emphasis on Olympic lifting and ballistic exercises such as the snatch, the power clean, and the push press. Lastly, this is the phase where you'll start a speed and agility program. During the power phase of training, a speed and agility routine is often incorporated into the weekly routine. So the speed and agility program is not designed for conditioning, so the work to rest interval is a lot longer than you would prescribe when the goal is to actually condition the athlete. So here, the work to rest ratio is 1:8. More importantly, the training should be focusing on the quality of the work and not the quantity. Here are some examples of speed technique and agility drills. These drills can be performed in a circuit style. So as you can see, With speed technique drills, we can see heel ups. You can start performing arm actions, and then as you can see, you can do some light sled pulls, cone jumps, and then 2 sprints of 30 yards. With agility drills, your most popular ones are going to be your T-tests, your pro agility tests, and then you can also do some other ones, such as the 15-yard turning drill or the 20-yard square drill, and then also you can incorporate agility ladder drills. The next phase of training is the peaking phase. This is where training is a very high intensity with very low training volume. The lower training volume gives the athlete additional time to focus on anaerobic conditioning exercises. The figure to the right provides an example of a resistance training program during the peaking phase. Additionally, during the final 2 or 3 weeks of the strength power phase and throughout the peaking phase, the athlete will focus on anaerobic conditioning. Remember that the peaking phase is if the competition period is 3 weeks or less, but if the competition period lasts more than 3 weeks, then a maintenance phase will be incorporated where the athlete will use moderate to high intensity with moderate training volume. Here's an example of an anaerobic conditioning program for speed, technique, and agility. As you can see at the initial start of this kind of peaking, the frequency is very low, but as you can see, starting like at week 6, you start incorporating more frequency of training, and then, as you continue on, once you get to week 8, this is pretty much training every day. Anaerobic conditioning is comprised of short and long distance sprints. It can also include interval training. When looking at the program design, the volume of training will increase week to week, and the intensity is controlled by altering the work-to-rest ratio. Towards preseason training, the time between each sprint should decrease, so by the end, the work-to-rest ratio should simulate actual performance. It is good to plan about 6 to 8 weeks of anaerobic conditioning to prepare the athletes for competition. Anaerobic athletes should not start preparing to be metabolically ready for a season of competition until about 2 to 4 weeks before the preseason training program. Until this phase, the athlete's off-season conditioning program is primarily focused on resistance training, power development such as plyometrics, and also sport-specific skill development, which may also include agility and speed development. Anaerobic conditioning is not emphasized until the preseason phase to prevent any possible overtraining syndrome from occurring during the season. For team sports, here is an example of a basketball player's anaerobic conditioning program. The reduction in the work-to-rest ratio you see from this example is to improve the recovery time between the bouts of high-intensity activity that mimics the activity you see during a basketball game. Some training methods that can be utilized is interval training or fartlek training during this conditioning period. Fartlek training uses alternating running at fast and low speeds. Usually this is utilized in a hilly terrain. So with fartlek training, what you'll be doing is, you'll start running at a slow speed, and then at a certain time point, you'll start running pretty fast, and then once that period is over, you'll start running back down slowly. So there is no actual, full rest or like complete rest where you're just sitting there for recovery. Your recovery is during these slow periods. Anaerobic training should focus on decreasing fatigue rate rather than preparing the athlete for repeated high-intensity activity over a long time period. This can be geared towards track athletes who perform the 400-meter dash. So you can see that there are long rest intervals between the sprints. The reason for this is to maximize the quality of each sprint. The 400-meter dash athlete doesn't have to worry about maintaining that performance at a high level for, say, 5 continuous minutes compared to a basketball player who is always moving during a game. Once the preseason begins and as the athlete enters the competition phase, the primary focus will be actual sports performance. As a strength and conditioning professional, the actual intensity of practice should be taken into consideration regarding the volume of conditioning drills. Also, the resistance training frequency is decreased compared to the off-season and preseason. It is important to maintain the strength and power gains that the athlete made in the previous phases. So during this time, the volume and intensity utilized during the strength phase is incorporated, and only the core lifts for the athlete is the primary focus of training, but they can also still include assistive exercises when necessary. We also need to consider endurance athletes. the training program for endurance athletes is also periodized to help them reach peak condition at the appropriate times of the year. When we look at endurance athletes, they are really preparing to a specific contest at the end of a competitive season. So therefore, these athletes actually train throughout the earlier contests to reach their peak performance at the end of the season. This differs for team sport athletes as all of the competitions are important. This is due to the team record and winning. So by winning more, the better chance to go into the playoffs, and then ultimately more favorable matchups, and then able to possibly win a championship. Another difference is that endurance athletes generally do not perform speed and agility training that much compared to team sport athletes. However, they still might incorporate it along with their resistance training program. The marathon distance is becoming more and more popular for recreational runners. This offers a challenge for individuals, and with proper training, this can be accomplished for many runners. We see training plans being offered online and then also through apps on your phone. This can also be seen for resistance training as well, with the free apps being offered online and through apps. But if the individual has a goal to improve performance for marathon distance, then adding a tempo or hill workout each week is beneficial. But if, say the athlete doesn't have any specific goals and really their goal is just to, finish the race, then you don't need to incorporate any special training methods. And when you have these individuals, performing marathons, for the first time, usually their main goal is to actually just finish the race at a running pace and no walks during that time. When we look at half marathons, they are also popular. And training for a half marathon requires reducing the volume compared to marathon distance. Specifically, we're reducing the training day for the long, slow distance work or adding some sort of speed session each week. Another sport to consider is the ultra endurance sports, where these ultra endurance sports they can last a day or two, or be well over 100 miles. So this type of training requires more volume but less intensity over a long training period. Here are some examples that show a marathon training program for a beginner and for an intermediate level athlete. Triathlon training can cross a wide spectrum of training areas depending on the distance of the competition. In all cases, though, training strategies include a variety of swimming, biking, and then running workouts. And these training strategies also utilize long, slow distance, interval training, fartlek training, and then also having some sort of recovery time period or some sort of method. The example on the right is for 2 weeks of triathlon training. A benefit of the 5K distance is that almost anyone at any fitness level can train to run a 5K in as little as 6 to 8 weeks. So training for a 5K consists of less volume and more intensity than that required for longer aerobic endurance events such as the half marathon and then the marathon. Intermediate runners should perform 1 or 2 training runs per week that are longer than the race distance. But for beginners, longer training runs may not be as necessary if their primary goal is just to finish the race. When completing speed workouts, they should be geared towards a specific distance. The goal should be to have the distance of the speed workout eventually equal the race distance. So the important thing is to gradually work up to the volume goal so you can avoid injury. This here just gives you an example of a 5K training plan for an intermediate runner. You can see that they incorporate a speed session on Tuesday, but mainly are focusing on long, slow distance training throughout the week. Also, you'll see the incorporation of longer than the race distance days on Sunday's training day. An integral part in the development of an athlete's training program and the evaluation of the effectiveness of the training program is the continuing monitoring and evaluation of the fitness and performance levels of the athlete. By properly assessing athletes, this will provide you with a greater understanding of how to maximize their performance. And the way to accomplish this is to test the athlete, as this will provide a thorough analysis of all the variables. Further, the results from the test will allow you to appropriately structure the program and also place emphasis on certain variables for the athlete. We've mentioned this earlier in the semester, but the testing can be utilized in different ways for the athlete. One is that it can be used as a baseline, data point. Second, it gives feedback in the evaluation of a training program where you might need to make some adjustments depending if the athlete is improving or not. Third, it will give insight on recovery following an injury so that the athlete knows where they were previously. And lastly, this provides some sort of motivation for the athlete. So in summary, the key to successfully developing the training resume for athletes is to base the program on sound scientific evidence, which we talked about here today in lecture, and then also in the previous weeks, and then throughout the course of the semester. This allows the strength and conditioning professionals, or you, to defend the program and to provide the best techniques to train their athletes. Individual workout sessions should always include a proper dynamic warm-up, and workouts should emphasize proper technique before actually increasing the load. Also, the basic goal of the off-season training is to enhance athletes' capabilities. The basic phases of most off-season training programs are the preparatory phase, the strength phase, the strength power phase, and the peaking phase. Lastly, the off-season training goal should be specific to the needs of the athlete.